Welcome to the Industrial Hygiene Solution, powered by IEHS and presented by Antea Group. This solution provides the technology enablement needed to efficiently and effectively administer an industrial hygiene program that protects employees against exposures. The solution enables pre-qualitative surveys, a desktop questionnaire process for organizations who really don't have a good handle on where risks exist. Quantitative risk assessment, which leads to recommendations for exposure monitoring. Exposure sample planning, centralized and permanent data accumulation. Reports that document exposure assessments performed on various individuals or groups performing different tasks. And most important, it creates and documents actions that mitigate against future exposures. This video will demonstrate how Antea Group and the IH solution fit the needs of Bombardier exactly as requested in the request for proposal. The combination of Antea Group's highly engaged commitment and this tool is the most innovative way that Bombardier can manage this program. With this IH solution, phase 1 can be started on time and completed on time with the IH data management system already in place. In addition, this will lead to the ability for Bombardier and Antea Group to quickly begin phase 2 and even quickly do phase 3A or B. Program development will be greatly facilitated with the existing IH tool provided by Antea Group. Standard forms in the tool appear in English, French, or Spanish depending on the user's preferences, and will be available to perform the qualitative risk assessments. The existing template, as it stands now, may work without any modifications. Data collection for sampling is included in the tool, and guides to assist the site HSC teams can be greatly facilitated with the tool and with what it uses for training and guidelines. The solution workflow is comprised of 5 components. The first is assessments. The second is sampling. The third is data analysis. The fourth is mitigation. And the fifth is reporting over the top of all of these. The first thing I do is I select the facility of concern. The second thing I do is I select the year in which this assessment is taking place. I click Submit. At the top is the opportunity to perform a pre-qualitative survey, the desktop questionnaire. Or I can go directly to the quantitative risk assessment. Or I can go to the addition of sampling plans. Phase 2 is assessments, so let's start with the pre-qualitative desktop questionnaire. This is an example questionnaire. These are the questions in our standard version, but can be customized. The idea behind these is to understand where more detail needs to be gathered and to determine where risks exist, particularly if your facility is one where you have very little knowledge of its current operations. I can post findings at any time that indicate the information associated with the results of this survey. These pre-qualitative surveys are typically done by individuals at the facility who are familiar with its operations. It can be done online and the data flows in so that corporate EH&S can review the results and assess whether or not additional quantitative risk assessment needs to take place. The next step in the assessment process is the quantitative risk assessment. These are the questions in our standard version, but can be customized. Ultimately, what it does is facilitates the ability to recommend or not recommend exposure monitoring, and then ultimately to record the decision to perform exposure monitoring. This data is typically filled in by corporate EH&S in concert with those at the facility so that there's a detailed quantitative assessment of risk for each location where the pre-qualitative survey indicated this level of detail is necessary. The findings allow for any finding to be input, such as the fact that this facility needs further quantitative exposure analysis. Once the quantitative risk assessment indicates that exposure sampling is warranted, the next step is sampling. I can choose a new sampling plan, or I can view sampling plans that have already been set up. This sampling plan, for example, is an annual sampling plan that tests for these exposures and is applied to this task or job and would cover this group of employees. These sample plans can be used over and over again, or I can create a new sample plan. Each sample plan allows up to 3 sets of different types of samples to be collected. They always include exposures to chemicals as well as noise. Once these are set and referenced to the appropriate quantitative risk assessment, I save those, and that is the instruction set for those performing the sampling. Data analysis is the next step enabled by the industrial hygiene solution. As you can see here in this list, the client has a number of different views, all of which analyze the data from a different perspective. The client can set any particular exposure limits and compare sampling results to those limits. They can be company-specific limits, country-specific limits, or any of the more standard limits that are often used. Lab results are uploaded automatically into the tool, and findings and corrective actions are input that enable mitigation steps to take place and to enable the process of notifying employees and having documentation of the records of exposure monitoring. With mitigations in place, post-evaluations and ongoing compliance can be assured through resampling, through establishing new baselines. The process continues using either the same sample plans or new sample plans. Either way, documentation is complete within the tool. Reporting exists over all the functions and steps within the tool. This reporting allows additional data analysis and provides management with various views of the data collected during a monitoring assessment program. For example, this report shows the overall exposure assessment results with employees over the limits that have been set. I select the year, the facility, the exposure type, the limits that were set in this particular year, and then I can select limits based on various countries. For this report, I can compare the exposure values to the limits for up to 2 countries. The system always uses widely accepted standards for exposure limits, and these options are in addition to those. The value of this report is immediate. For this facility that was sampled, and these job descriptions and employees sampled for these exposures, the sample results came back at these exposure levels with these exposure level units, and those results are compared against the OSHA exposure limits and client exposure limits. In addition, you can see the limits for the country of Brazil. The red indicates exceedances of the exposure limits, whereas the green indicates that the results are below that country's exposure limits. We'll look at one more report, the facility recommendations and corrective actions. We'll select 2017, both facilities and the exposure type as air, and click finish. In this report, there are 3 tabs. The first one shows the facility recommendations and corrective actions that came from the quantitative risk assessment. The second tab shows the sample plan groups that were utilized during the sampling and the recommendations and corrective actions associated with those. And the third shows by employee the recommendations and corrective actions that were entered for each employee who was in the sample groups when the sampling took place. The solution provides functionality to the following beneficiaries. For corporate leads, it's program management, planning and reporting, and data insights at various levels. For industrial hygiene professionals who are reviewing the data, doing data analysis, establishing mitigation, it's the sample planning and data accumulation workflow, the specific deliverables that come therefrom, and the results reporting that are consistently and effectively analyzed. For facility leads, the pre-qualitative questionnaires allow those facilities to be identified with risk. Findings and corrective actions are managed at the facility level typically, and at the facility level, employee notifications and records management become available to those with proper authorization. In conclusion, Antea Group and the IHS Industrial Hygiene Module perfectly fit the needs of Bombardier for a data management system. As a result, Bombardier's phases 1 through 6 can be implemented much quicker, much more timely, much more efficiently, and much more cost effectively.